Good morning. This is Kathy Culverson from the University of Florida, and I would like to welcome everyone to the USAID Ingenius sponsored webinar on aflatoxins and extension in Zambia, how agricultural extension systems can help support women's strategies for reducing household exposure to aflatoxins. And I would like to give just a brief background of what Ingenius is. Ingenius is a USAID-funded project that stands for Integrating Gender and Nutrition into Agricultural Extension Systems. It is composed of a consortium of partners led by the University of Illinois, or University of Florida, University of California at Davis, and Cultural Practice are all consortium members working in 8 different countries, which include Zambia, Tajikistan, Nepal, Honduras, Bangladesh, Uganda, and Sierra Leone. We have been working in these countries for a few years, and we will continue to work throughout the remainder of the year. But we are delighted to have with us today Dr. Alyson Young from the University of Florida to present this webinar. Dr. Young is a nutritional anthropologist with a particular focus on maternal and child health and nutrition, and she did her research work with students in Zambia in 2015 and 2016. She will present on her findings, and then there will be an opportunity for questions after. Thank you very much, and welcome, Dr. Young.
Thank you, Kathy. I really appreciate it. I would also like to identify Dr. Juliet Akello, who is joining us as a panelist from Zambia. Without her, none of the work in Zambia would have been possible, so I definitely want to make sure that she's also acknowledged as a partner to Ingenius. So what I would like to do is briefly talk about the role of toxins in child nutrition and health, but also sort of a larger discussion about what are the different constraints on men and women's abilities to both gain information about toxins and food safety, and also what are the constraints on their ability to respond to it. Chronic exposure to toxins is an important but often under-recognized problem. Risks from exposure are insidious. It may not actually be something that occurs or appears acutely, like other illnesses do. However, it has a significant impact on health and nutrition, and ultimately also talking about economic capacity and development. However, men and women are not equally exposed to toxins, and in particular we'll talk here about aflatoxins. And they don't always have the same ability to access information or respond to concerns about and hazards from toxins. And I think extension services play a very important role in both disseminating production information and discussing foodborne toxin information with farmers. However, one of the things that has to be kept in mind is the fact that we have to reach out to all farmers. And one of the challenges has been reaching out to farmers that are vulnerable, very small scale farmers, and also female farmers. So part of what I'd like to do today is use the work that I've been doing in Zambia as a way to discuss some of the challenges that we face when we're talking about both the information about foodborne toxins and also how people are able to respond to them. So just to give a brief overview of this presentation, what we will do today is I'll give a brief introduction to aflatoxins and strategies for their control. And then I'd like to use the work that I'm doing in Zambia as a case study that illustrates how gender roles and household labor allocation can influence women's strategies for aflatoxin control. And then I'd like to discuss the implications for improving extension service provision. Some of the things that we can take away from this particular case study and some broader issues in terms of reaching out to women and men with information on nutrition-sensitive agriculture. So first, what are aflatoxins? Aflatoxins, broadly speaking, are fungal toxins that are present in a number of staple crops. We've known about them since the 1960s, and we've been aware of their health effects since the 1960s, but they've recently had a resurgence in the discussion about agricultural production, particularly in an economic development context. They're really reappearing in discussions of nutrition-sensitive agriculture because of their impact on both child growth and nutrition, and also talking about their impacts on things like food security at the household level, and then economic development at the national level. So they have widespread and important implications for talking about individual health and nutrition, capacity building, and economic development at a household and national level. One of the things that is challenging about aflatoxins, one of the economic impacts that they have, is their impact on the ability of a country or of an individual to export crops. What this table shows is a list of the maximum risk levels of acceptance for total aflatoxin contamination for different countries and organizations. And I bring this up because these are some of the levels that play an important role in whether or not a country or a company, for example, can export crops. And this is really important in a lot of contexts where you have fewer economic resources, because it requires having the research capacity to both test for and continue to monitor the levels of aflatoxins in order to be able to export crops. And this has really been a challenge. And so when you're talking about aflatoxins, there's this multi-level component to it. It's not just about the individual farmer, but it's also about the ways in which this is impacting economic development and health across the entire system. So how do crops get contaminated with aflatoxins? There's a couple different factors that can influence contamination. And there's a number of different stages at which contamination can occur. Pre-harvest, there are things like repeated cultivation of host plants, so plants that may be more vulnerable to aflatoxins, for example. Late planting, which can change the moisture levels in the plant and have other impacts. Drought, which can impact the environment and vulnerability or susceptibility to attacks from insects, and also limited water, making plants more vulnerable to the fungal toxins, or well, the fungus that causes the toxins. Termite attacks, and poor field hygiene, plant density, and also poor water management. So these are some of the things that make crops more susceptible to aflatoxin contamination. During harvest, there are a number of things in terms of harvesting techniques that can have an impact on susceptibility to aflatoxin contamination. Things where, for example, the harvesting technique damages the shells or damages the seeds. And in terms of harvest, the timing, in terms of premature harvest or late harvest, and the impacts that that has on both the moisture content of the plants and also their sort of susceptibility overall. And then post-harvest, there's a number of different things. Improper drying. It's very important post-harvest to control the moisture levels of the crops to help prevent the aflatoxins, or to prevent the fungal toxins and the fungus from proliferating. Improper shelling practices. This is something that I'll talk about a little bit more in terms of the discussions I had with women in Zambia. One of the practices that occurs in a number of places is where water is added to groundnut shells, for example, as a way to make the shells easier to open. However, the problem is that increases the moisture content and can increase the risk for fungal contamination and proliferation. Poor curing techniques are a problem. Poor stripping practices, grading and sorting issues. One of the things that's very important is sorting out those, in this case, groundnuts that are potentially damaged or potentially have aflatoxin contamination. And this can make a big difference in terms of the the amount of aflatoxin contamination that occurs, but it also can be a significant source of contamination if they're not well sorted. Poor storage conditions, and then also transport can play an important role in terms of if transport methods either damage the seeds or there's improper moisture control that occurs during that time. There are a number of ways to reduce aflatoxin contamination. So there are crop management strategies, post-harvest household strategies, and then post-harvest processor strategies that all are important in terms of controlling aflatoxin contamination overall. So a number of the crop management strategies tie back to what I just mentioned in terms of what makes plants more susceptible to aflatoxin contamination and proliferation. Early planting, good field hygiene, doing things for water harvesting, different soil amendments and biocontrol mechanisms can be very helpful. Making sure that the timing of harvest is appropriate so that you're basically harvesting at the peak time to minimize the amount of moisture, but make sure you have the healthiest seeds. Avoiding pod injury. And then also soil removal. So removing the soil off of the seeds once they're pulled from the ground so that you're not bringing along any of the contaminated soil when you're bringing those seeds into storage. In terms of post-harvest, proper shelling plays an important role, as I mentioned, proper drying, grading and sorting, and storage. And you'll see the end of this webinar, I have a number of links that are available that have really good information for providing information to farmers about how to avoid these sorts of things. So if you'd like more information on that, you can look at those links or please contact any of us for more information. And in terms of post-harvest processor strategies, there's the sorting before shelling, the grading, and avoiding using grade out. So avoiding including those seeds that look like they're potentially contaminated or damaged or something like that, because again, it increases the risk of contamination. And what's really important about this is that this is something where there's the value chain component of it. And so if the farmer is doing everything that they possibly can to avoid contamination, but then they take those seeds to a processing facility where someone else has not done that, then there's the risk for contamination occurring. And so this has to be something that's worked on a number of different levels, not just with individual farmers, but having extension services that help work with processors, for example, to make sure that their facilities are as sanitary as possible, or everything's being done to avoid contamination at different stages of the value chain. So a little bit more information about where the research that I'm going to talk about, the case study, was conducted. As Dr. Culverson mentioned, this research took place over the course of several months in 2015 and 2016. The primary places that we worked were in Eastern Province, Zambia, which you can see on the map here. And there's three particular sites, Chipata, Petaoke, and Katete, where the interviews were done with women in particular. I'll talk a little bit more about that. The data that I'm going to present was collected using a combination of techniques. We used focus group interviews with women. We used participatory risk analysis with women, asking them about how they evaluate the risk of things like aflatoxins against other things that they consider to be high risk in the household, like nutritional issues, concerns about infectious disease, those sorts of things. And then also just individual interviews with women to get a better understanding of their individual experiences and understanding of aflatoxins and what they had been dealing with in terms of constraints. So this chart is showing you information that had to do with the responses we received from women when we asked about several different domains associated with aflatoxin risk. So first, we asked women, we were trying to assess women's basic knowledge about the factors that contribute to aflatoxins, what they know about how you respond to aflatoxins, what sorts of signs they use to identify these. One of the challenges with aflatoxins, of course, is that you can't taste them, you can't smell them, and even if you have mold on a plant, it doesn't necessarily mean that it is a toxin-producing fungus. And so it can be a very challenging thing for farmers to identify in terms of whether or not they need to be concerned about contamination. And what this chart is showing is basically the percentage of women who responded in that they agreed, they disagreed, or they didn't know about these different aspects or different domains about aflatoxin risk. And one of the things that you can see here is that, in fact, there was a fair amount of consensus among women about those things which could contribute to risk for aflatoxins. And the way that we designed this was we looked at those factors which had been identified as things that will contribute to increasing the risk of aflatoxin contamination or proliferation. And then we asked women about these. Do you agree or disagree that, for example, wetting groundnut shells during shelling is a factor that contributes to risk for aflatoxins? And we divided this up into factors that contribute to risk, foods commonly contaminated by aflatoxins, and then signs of contamination. So we wanted to have a general sense of the ways in which women were making decisions about how they went about production activities, decisions they were making about safe foods within the household, and then what they were using as indicators of aflatoxin risk. And again, what you see here is that there's a fair amount of consensus in these. And the one place, though, that we saw there was less consensus and was really interesting was when we talked about the foods that were commonly contaminated with aflatoxins. So a lot of the women that we worked with had already been exposed to a lot of different messages. They are in the zone of influence for USAID in Zambia, and so there have been a number of different really good activities that have gone on to help provide education about aflatoxins. However, the challenge is that the perceptions of places where there was risk varied. So, for example, almost all of the women identified that they knew that staple crops were vulnerable to aflatoxin contamination. But fewer women, around only about 60%, thought that store-bought foods had the potential to be contaminated by aflatoxins. And the reason this is challenging is because, in fact, when you look at levels of aflatoxins in the stores, you see that aflatoxin levels are actually above acceptable levels. And this is a very good example of why the aflatoxin, tackling aflatoxin contamination needs to be taken on at multiple levels. Because it's not just about the information that we provide women and men about it, it's also about what happens during processing. The other thing we asked about, of course, were the signs of aflatoxin contamination and how people were identifying these things. And two of the things that came out as universal were discussions of white mold inside the pod and a bitter taste. And the bitter taste is a challenge because, in fact, aflatoxins have no taste. And so the bitter taste may actually have to do with the fact that the ground nuts that are more likely to be contaminated are also ones that are rotting. And so they may have a bitter taste from that reason. But it's something that's really important in terms of when you're talking to farmers about how are they identifying aflatoxins, is trying to understand more about what they're using as signs and work on communicating about what signs to look for, what signs are not going to be as useful, that sort of thing. The other thing that came out in this research, which was really interesting, was the discussion about groundnut production, so control over the different stages in groundnut production, and gender. And the reason that this is an important component of this is because this really gets at the core of some of the things that we deal with as in extension services, which is sort of how do we reach out to everybody to get this information to them, and then how do we evaluate what the constraints are that keep them from being able to use this information. And this is one place, at least among this sample of individuals, where this became very important. So as you saw in the previous slide, there was the amount of information about aflatoxins was fairly ubiquitous. However, the ability to respond to that information varied quite a bit across the different households. And one of the things that played a major role was how much control women had over the production of groundnuts and the different stages in the value chain in terms of talking about household production of groundnuts. In Zambia, groundnuts are identified as a woman's crop. And there's a lot of excellent work out there on what this means in terms of it being a woman's crop. But one of the things that's really important about it is simply because a crop is identified as a woman's crop doesn't necessarily mean that they have control over it. It just means that they often contribute most of the labor to it. And this really became important when we talked about aflatoxin, reducing aflatoxin risk in groundnuts, because women who had more control over production were more likely to be able to take control of those steps that needed to be done to reduce aflatoxins. And so this is an important component for talking about doing household level extension outreach and looking at ways in which we can transform discussions of control over production and the ways in which it can influence household nutrition and susceptibility to toxins. So just a sort of overview on some of the things that also came up that are important about this. So one of the things, part of what is important with control over production is that having control of production allowed women the flexibility to choose or to seek out labor to help with different productive activities. And that actually provided them with more time to do things like be able to go to farmer field schools, for example, or to get access to different services and technology. The less control that women had over production, the less able they were to do some of these things, which has an impact on the amount of information the woman has access to and her ability to actually respond to some of the things that create problems in terms of aflatoxin contamination and proliferation. The other thing that occurred, though, too, is the discussion of the role that labor played in a woman's ability to follow best practices for reducing aflatoxins. Women who had less access to help with the different stages of production were more likely to report that they had problems timing the harvest when they knew they were supposed to, following best practices in terms of drying techniques, and following best practices in terms of processing strategies. And what's important about this is it highlights the fact that it really isn't just about information, it's also about understanding what it is that constrains people's ability to use that information and trying to work within extension services to sort of do a multi-pronged approach that allows us to help improve access to information, but also improve the ability to actually act on that information. Finally, the other thing I want to bring up here is the ways in which women were interpreting the risks from aflatoxins in relation to the other types of risks they felt that they had at the household. And this played an important role in the decisions that women made about how to use foods, for example, that might be considered less safe. And one example of this was when I talked to women and they said that what they were doing is they were saving the groundnuts that were the least likely to be sold. So basically the worst quality groundnuts were being saved and used at the household level. And they were making that decision even though they knew that that increased the risk of aflatoxin exposure, because they wanted to sell the better groundnuts so that they could get more money to be able to diversify children's diets by purchasing other foods. And so this is a really important example of the ways in which women weigh and compare the risks and their concerns about, or their strategies for how to help improve household nutrition and health. The other thing that we looked at were livelihood constraints, which I've discussed briefly already. But basically, what were women able to do within the context of their livelihoods, the overall household livelihood strategies, those kinds of things. So briefly, implications in terms of extension services. I think the things that came out most clearly from from the case studies are, one, the importance of considering the different constraints that men and women face when organizing and designing trainings. This is really crucial in terms of reaching everyone. I also think it's important in terms of thinking about different ways in which men and women may be receiving and processing the information that they get about things like aflatoxin risks and other types of information on agricultural production. Men and women have, and there's a fair amount of literature on this actually, men and women have different perceptions of risk and different priorities in terms of how they respond to that. And that's another thing that needs to be taken into account when we're thinking about how we most effectively design trainings, how we tailor information for different populations, so that we're taking into account the ways in which that information may be received, but then also what are the different constraints on how people act on that information, what they're thinking about it. And then the other thing is that there's a lot of different ways in which development organizations can help provide agricultural extension officers and services with additional tools to help, for example, with trainings for gender, nutrition-sensitive agriculture, those sorts of things. And so in many areas, extension services are really stretched to their limit. And these sorts of collaborations may be ways in which we can help offset some of those challenges, but also help to harmonize messaging that goes out about, nutrition, agriculture, production, and those sorts. Finally, I just wanted to point out some additional resources. I had a number of people who have contacted me prior to this webinar and sent me some fantastic stuff. There's a timeline. ICRISAT has a timeline on aflatoxins that I find really useful. There's an excellent video on managing aflatoxin in groundnuts. It's a really good one for training purposes. ICRISAT also has a very good guide for extension workers on how to reduce aflatoxin contamination. And finally, Ingenius has actually been building a database of different types of training materials and tools for all sorts of different aspects of extension. And this is another resource that has a lot of different tools available that are freely available to people to modify and use. Thank you. I just wanted to do a final thank you and provide an opportunity for anyone who has questions to please ask them.
Yeah, hi, this is Katie. I've been behind the scenes here and looking at a couple of the questions that have been asked. You guys can either click on the Q&A box and ask your question in that, or you can type it into the chat. So Alyson, we have a first question from Laura Smith. She says, how did you translate aflatoxin? Is there a specific word in the local language? Did women know what aflatoxin was?
So actually, I'll do both. I'll answer by text and speak live at the same time. We use the term chiku. It is a term that is used locally to describe aflatoxins. And yeah, my experience with women, at least the women that I worked with, was yes, they knew what aflatoxins were. Could they describe the specific, metabolism of aflatoxins in the body and that sort of thing? No, that specific information wasn't there. But the information about aflatoxins, the risk for aflatoxins in food production and those sorts of things were there.
Okay, thanks. Second question from Serena Stepanovic from URC. They support the Zambia Malwa project. She says, did you find any changes in perceived control and roles for groundnut production and marketing between your study results and those of the 2012 Profit Plus gender barrier analysis that covered some of the same issues?
Can you, I'm sorry, that one is actually not coming up on my screen. Can you reread that one so I can answer it?
Yeah, Serena, you actually typed this into the chat. If you could put it into the Q&A box, that might help. It's earlier in your chat box, actually, Alyson, if you want to read it.
Oh, okay.
From S. Stepanovic at 9 a.m. If you can see that.
Okay.
You just answer live.
Yeah. So the question is excellent, actually, about these the changes in perceived control and roles for ground production. Yeah, there were some differences. We're working on the analysis actually now to sort of look at those more closely. I think what's challenging about this is that there's a lot of different factors that influence this, and it may be related to the interventions, it may be related to other extrinsic factors. But I'd be more than happy to share that information with you when we finalize the study.
Okay. So she just said thanks. And then we have a next question from Joseph Molnar. What unit of government will carry on your work after the project is over? How are you treating these people? Are you connecting them to continued support?
Yeah, I think, so what we're trying to do with this, so the role of Ingenius is actually to help support Feed the Future programs in the work that they're already doing. And so a big part of what Ingenius has been trying to do with this is to help link together organizations that are working on different aspects of aflatoxins. There are different activities going on at multiple levels, and I think Juliet actually, since she's working in Zambia specifically on these issues, is probably a more qualified person to talk about what's going on at different levels. There have been multiple things going on, but we're trying to link up partners and sort of find ways to create sustainable relationships between them. And yeah, that's been an ongoing process.
Okay, thanks, Alyson. From Jayaruwani, I probably pronounced that wrong, sorry. Why do different countries use different maximum risk levels of contamination?
So this is something I think would be an excellent question for Juliet, because she really deals with a lot of this. My understanding is, just like with any other type of discussion about food safety, the different organizations that are involved set their own levels. So for example, the EU has a different level in terms of what they consider to be an acceptable toxin level from what the US uses. How those decisions are made, I'm not actually entirely sure. They're usually based on evidence-based methods for identifying those sort of basic levels, but it also depends on kind of how stringent the rules and regulations are about what will be allowed into the food.
Hi, Alyson. I just unmuted Juliet in case she wants.
Oh, thank you. Julia, do you have anything you can answer for these that might be much more clear than what I said?
Thank you, Alyson, first and foremost, for a wonderful presentation. You have rightly put it in that some of the countries, it's really dependent on the stringent regulations they have in place. But normally when you are talking about the risks regarding aflatoxin, it's actually based on the kilogram per body weight, or microgram rather per body weight of an individual that can really contain the amount of aflatoxin that someone can consume. So based on that, different countries have set really the levels as they deem right to provide safe, to ensure that their population is really safe and kept safe from this aflatoxin. So it's basically the regulations that each country or the community, like the EU community, feel that if an individual consumes this amount, then it's a risk factor for that person, and therefore they say this is the amount we are allowing, because based on the quantity that an individual can take, the tolerable limit that an individual can consume, that is what they use for setting the limit. Thank you. I hope.
Thanks, Juliet.
Yeah.
Okay, so our next question from Abby Love. Alyson, do you see this? It's kind of a long question.
I do, yes.
I'll read it, but you will probably also want to read it. When she says, when you say risk preferences should be taken into account, what actions do you recommend? Knowing about differences in risk preferences is one thing, but how do we alter the training accordingly?
That's an excellent question. I think that that's really one of the important things about the, that integration between the research component and the actual practice of it. I think what I'm trying to suggest with this is that we need to incorporate into the training some way of sort of identifying where people's knowledge and perception levels are when we start them, so that we aren't so that we can tailor them in a way that is effective for dealing with those particular issues or concerns that people are having. And I think there's a range of different ways to do this, and there's a lot of really good tools for sort of doing participatory work with community members, doing participatory work in extension that helps make clear what the perceptions and concerns are of the farmers you're working with or the organizations you're working with, and then responding to those in a way that's helpful. I know Ingenius has some information on it, and I can also see if I can track down some of the other information on sort of trying to work on participatory risk and translate that into effective practice.
Okay. Thanks, Alyson. So we have a quick follow-up question. Sorry, going back a little bit. Do you remember the question about maximum risk levels of contamination?
Yes.
Diane DiBernardo wanted to follow up on that. Why would different countries draw such different conclusions? Do you have a thought on that?
I am going to punt that to Juliet. I think my take on it, though, is that just like you see with discussions of things like the use of GMOs and other types of food safety issues, that there are just simply different levels of tolerance in terms of what countries and organizations will allow for. But maybe Juliet can answer that in a much more effective way.
Alyson, I did get the question clearly. Can you repeat, please?
Katie, can you repeat it?
Sure. We're just wondering why different countries would draw such different conclusions about the maximum risk levels of contamination. Why would they draw such different conclusions?
Like I said, initially it was really based on the Codex Alimentaris, but then with the time, different countries, depending on what they have on the ground, for example, certain countries don't have really this fungus, and probably they would want to protect the population, and that is why they would end up saying we want commodities meeting these safety levels. That is one. The other one is on the tolerable level that an individual can really bear when he or she consumes the aflatoxin. So you would find that the risk for the young, for example, and the elderly is much higher than for a normal or an adult who is healthy. And as such, you'll find that some countries will say for children, we will set the limit at, say, less than 2 parts per billion, because a kid would not be able, or a child may not be able to tolerate higher levels. So basically, normally it's set at based on the microgram per kilogram of body weight that an individual can contain without dying. And that's why different countries set up different levels that they deem fit would protect the citizens.
Thanks so much, Juliet. Okay, we'll move on to the next question from Joy Kaufman. She says, we are promoting nixtamalization as a means of mitigating aflatoxin in Uganda. Have you explored this option? She says she would love to find research funding to explore it further.
Juliet, you're more familiar with what's been going on the ground in Zambia. Is this being used? Is this approach being promoted?
Thank you, Alyson. Thank you, Joy, for the question. In Zambia, basically the research has focused on good agronomic practices, biocontrol, and of course, good pre-harvest or hygienic means of handling commodities after harvest. Of course, this method has been tried in Kenya, but it's relatively expensive, and that's why we try, or researchers in Zambia have tried to use a rather cheaper option for managing this aflatoxin in maize and groundnut value chains, primarily because some of these practices farmers have already been using their agronomic practices, and therefore it would be cheaper than using this method. So no, in Zambia, I'm not aware of any company or industry that is utilizing this method to mitigate aflatoxin. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, let me find the next question. This is from Asilagi. I'm not sure how to say that actually. Sorry. So how do you think Zambians learned about aflatoxins? Most places I've worked, farmers have never heard of them. This includes most people, including Americans.
Yeah, this is actually an excellent question, and I would agree. Most of the people that I've contacted, and to be fair, I'm a social scientist, and so for, a lot of the folks that I am in contact with on a regular basis really are outside of the realm of the agroecology stuff. But yeah, a lot of people don't know what aflatoxins are or are not aware that they're a thing. I think in this particular case, and as I mentioned earlier, you know, Eastern Province has been the zone of influence for USAID, and as a result, there's a lot of different NGOs that have been working on different aspects of production, food safety, those sorts of things. And so in this sample that I was working with, I think a lot of the women and men that I talked to had learned about it through NGO activities, through development projects that have been going on, that sort of thing. I don't have a very good sense of how this relates more broadly to the prevalence of knowledge about aflatoxins across Zambia. My sense is it's probably higher in this particular region simply because of the sort of intensive nature of the activities that have been going on. But yeah, it's an important thing. I'm not saying, I'm just to be clear, I'm not saying that we shouldn't continue education programs. I think that is a crucial part of this. Is there are plenty of individuals who don't know about aflatoxins, but I think the education component has to be paired with, you know, trying to identify and find ways to respond to the other constraints that keep people from being able to use that information in an effective way.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, I'm doing too many things. So we have a next question from, actually a clarification from Stacia Norden from the Malawi consortium. She has a clarification or a correction from the slide on how to reduce aflatoxin contamination. She says soil removal is under crop management strategies, but in speaking, it was more under harvest, which is more correct. During crop growth, the soil should not be removed during the time the crop is growing. So I'm not sure if,
yeah, okay.
Yeah, okay, great. Thanks for that.
Thank you, that's a very important clarification.
Yeah, and it's kind of hard for the participants because they can't actually speak, so sorry if I butchered.
I know.
So this next question is from Renata Sarah. She says, well, she thanks you for the presentation. You made the crucial point that the main issue for women is not just access to information, but the ability to act upon that information. Where does this finding leave us, considering that it is easier for development actors to provide information rather than changing gender control over production?
So I think this is yet another really excellent question. And I think it speaks more to the ways in which we think about, you know, extension activities more broadly. and how you integrate things like information and transformative approaches that help improve or help increase the capacity of individuals and organizations to respond to these types of things. It is certainly not an easy, there's no easy answer to this. I think that it's in, and again, probably because I'm coming from a social science background, you know, this is in this context of limited resources, limited ability for even extension folks to get training in some of these contexts. And I think perhaps this may be one of those places where some of the partnerships can be helpful, because it means that one individual or organization doesn't need to make all of these changes. But if we partner together, experts and you know, intersectoral approaches to dealing with how to, you know, most effectively reach out to people, but then also how to create spaces for change. I think that may be one of the ways in which we can help move this forwards. But it's an excellent question, something I think we have to keep in mind as we're, you know, doing this.
Okay, thanks. Let's move on to the next question. Stacia Norden again asks, are there standards in Zambia for the store-bought commodities?
Juliet, I'm going to send this one to you because you've been working a lot with this recently.
The question is?
Are there standards in Zambia for the store-bought commodities in terms of aflatoxin levels?
I'm not getting you clearly, Alyson.
Go ahead, Katie.
Yeah, sure. Juliet, I hope you can hear me. Stacia's wondering, are there standards in Zambia for store-bought commodities?
Standards?
Yes, like I would think regulation or some sort of.
Yeah.
Yes.
Basically, we have a standard that have been prepared based on the Codex Alimentarius as well as the one from COMESA. So tentatively, it has been agreed on 10 parts per billion for aflatoxins in commodities in general. But of course, it's still being revised and worked on.
Okay, thank you so much, Juliet. I'm going to move on to the next question. We're getting a little short on time, so we'll try to get all of these in. Chapwa asks, do you think there's room for plant breeding to play a role in curbing aflatoxin contamination? I am aware that resistance or tolerance is a complex issue, but I'm wondering in terms of genetic variation, do you think broadening the gene pool of a crop through the introduction of exotic genes would offer some level of inherent resistance or tolerance of varieties in use? So this question was entered at 9:12 a.m. if you want to read it yourself.
Yes, I see it. And again, this is, I think, more in the realm of Juliet's expertise. Yes, I think that there is a role for plant breeding to play an important role in this in terms of, you know, there's a range of different ways that plant breeding could influence or curb aflatoxin contamination. You know, there's if you think through the different components of, or the different factors which influence the susceptibility to aflatoxin contamination proliferation. So for example, drought, or, you know, if you have plants, for example, where not all of the seeds mature at the same time, which is one of the challenges with groundnuts. You know, there's a lot of different ways in which could have an impact. Julia, do you have more specific information or anything that you know of that's being used that's been really effective?
Thank you, Alyson. Chapwa, I think we have discussed this briefly at one point. Yes, of course, breeding has a big role to play, as Alyson has put it, in reducing aflatoxin. But for the past 40 years, this is what a number of researchers have been doing in order to find varieties that can really, Sorry about that. For a number of years, they have been breeding for resistance and trying to find varieties that would not succumb to aflatoxin infection or the fungus that causes this, but they have not really been able to come up with a tolerant or a resistant variety for now. Of course, if you use some of the varieties, if research has done research in this area, if you use it hand in hand with other management practices, then definitely you get a higher reduction level in aflatoxin. For example, research was done in Nigeria where they tried some of the hybrids for maize and used it hand in hand with a biocontrol, and indeed the level of reduction was much higher. What I know for now is the role of biotech, where they're trying to use gene silencing to manage aflatoxin. So in terms of gene silencing, that research is ongoing and it's promising. And that is what I can say. Thank you.
Thanks, Juliet. So next question from Joseph Molnar asked, how is your work addressing the problem of farmers using contaminated seed, of making clean seed available, and of promoting post-harvest storage and handling to minimize contamination?
So this is an excellent question, and in fact, looking at it, it ties into some of the questions that come up a little bit further along about the role of the other actors in the value chain, the role of marketing, for example, in terms of producer behavior and that kind of thing. And we're working through analyzing the material we collected. We did specific research in 2016 on the role of other market forces and sort of extrinsic factors on the decisions that households are making about seed choice and the ways in which they market different types of products. And it's sort of its own presentation in itself, but I'd be happy to share that when the analysis is done.
Okay, excellent. Next question from Victor Pinga. Thanks for the informative session. I wonder if Alyson can speak about potential market-based solutions that may be promoted to reduce aflatoxin risk at the household level.
Yeah, so this is actually one of the questions that I was referring to. So this was the work that we just did in 2016 about the market-based solutions. We looked at what the different factors were at the market level that might contribute to farmer decisions about following safe practices. And we're in the process of working through the analysis on that now, and I'd be happy to share it when it's done.
Okay, and then from Nick Kie, which specific method or methods were used to collect the information on aflatoxin knowledge?
There were a number of them that were used. The best way to answer this is probably, there's a publication coming out in economic anthropology that details the research and goes through the methods that were used, how we selected participants and all that, and I'd be more than happy to share that.
Okay, we'll send these things in a follow-up email to the participants. Okay, so Joy Kaufman has another question. I think this was a comment actually to another question. Do you see the one from 917?
Mm-hmm, I do. Yes.
Or do we want to leave that for later?
As long as Joy doesn't mind, I think it'd be good to try and get to the other questions that we have that tackle some of the things we haven't talked about.
Yep, you can contact her directly. Okay, so Stacia says regarding hygiene versus climate smart agriculture, there seems to be a conflict in messaging. What does hygiene mean to you, Alyson, or you, Juliet?
So I understand she's bringing up an excellent point, that hygiene can mean different types of things. If you're talking about hygiene, in a lot of cases, you're talking about clearing the field entirely. But when you're talking about climate safe, it may not be that particular mechanism. And I think this is one of the things we also have to tackle a little bit in terms of information and harmonizing some of the messages. In the case that I was talking about, I will, and I think this is something that I was using hygiene more broadly in terms of reducing the types of things that could be present in the field that would increase the risk of contamination or proliferation. However, I think it's really important to be more specific about that, and I will, moving forwards, be more specific about how we use that term, because it does vary depending on the context.
Excellent. Thanks. So I'm going to do another one from Stacia. Actually, this is from Maggie, Stacia, Robert, Sheelix, Faso, and Alim from Malawi. Did issues of enforcement and consumer rights or education come up?
Sorry, can you tell me which one specifically you're looking at?
Sure, it's from 9:22 a.m. from Stacia Norden.
In addition to issue of regulation, yes, I can't agree more. It is about regulation. Enforcement is challenging, and I think there's a number of levels to both making sure that we have the capacity for consumer rights and education, and also regulation and enforcement. And it's something that I briefly brought up at the beginning of the presentation. You know, across different countries, there are different levels of economic resources that can be put towards both regulatory and research capacity. And this is one of the big challenges, is trying to find ways in which we can build all of these different capacities in an effective way. There have been plenty of discussions about the ways in which, you know, the different levels of, what the different acceptable levels of contamination can actually serve as an additional tax to a lot of poor countries, because they have to find a way to build the capacity to reach, you know, to reach those levels of acceptable contamination, and that can be very problematic. So yeah, I mean, I agree with her completely that these things are all important. It can't be just one thing we focus on, and this is probably one of the reasons why we're still working through this, right? Is that there are so many parts of this that are combined, and can be very hard to tease apart.
Okay, thanks. I think we have time for one, maybe two more questions. Okay. This is from Jaya Ruwani. Do you think the education on aflatoxin reduces the level of contamination rather than helping people to improve their living standards? One time you mentioned that women keep the low quality harvest for them and sell the good harvest.
Yeah, so this is another excellent point that it's being made. You know, I think what this draws out is the fact that you can't have one thing in the absence of really taking into account all of the other factors that contribute to it. Sure, I think education in reducing aflatoxins helps to reduce levels of contamination, but there are other things that realistically, if we don't improve them, are going to undercut all of those improvements, right? So, you know, for example, if you manage to limit the range of the contamination with aflatoxins, but people still don't have access to adequate nutrition, diversity, and food, you're still running into some of the same problems. I think this is where it's hard to tease apart exactly what components of this are, or why it's important to actually identify which components are having the biggest influence on things like household nutrition and well-being. But it's also one of the reasons why it's very hard to do.
Okay, I think that this is a great last question for us to end on. Belay asked, or says that importance of partnership was emphasized to prevent aflatoxins. Which organizations need to be included in the partnership?
Yeah, this is a really good question. I mean, this is certainly something, like many others that we deal with. Extension is something where it's multiple stakeholders, and I think there's a range of different groups, and I'm going to refer to it as stakeholders rather than specific individuals, but I think this is where an intersectoral approach that brings in, you know, both the economic development component, the health messaging component, the agricultural information. I think part of it is about finding ways to coordinate these organizations and coordinate the messages between organizations. The more inclusive we can be, the better. However, as I'm sure all of us know, the more inclusive we are, the harder it is to do that. But I think, you know, a big part of it is about it depends on who you're trying to target with the information. I think that's the important part too, because depending on what level you're working at, it's going to change the different organizations who need to be involved. I think the important part about it is to try to be as inclusive and as possible in terms of both international organizations as well as local organizations, and then organizations to deal with different aspects of the problem.
Okay, great. Thanks so much. I think we'll end here, and I just wanted to thank everyone again for coming to the webinar. It's good to see some familiar names as well as some new ones. So we will be sending out an email with the webinar recording as well as some of the resources that Alyson mentioned in the next day or so. So look out for that and feel free to forward that to anyone who you think might be interested.
And I just want to add thank you to everyone for the fantastic questions and for being part of this. And if you'd like to get in touch with me, please feel free. I'd be happy to try and answer any additional questions that I can.
Okay, thanks, and have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.